Okay, so we were talking about the new political parties that were emerging. We already talked about how the Free Soil Party was anti-slavery, but only anti-slavery for the expansion west. They were fine with keeping slavery in the territories that already had it, right? Whereas the Liberty Party was basically absolutely anti-slavery. They believe that all territories and states should no longer have slaves. All right. So where are we going? Getting closer to the actual Civil War. In 1848, we have a Whig who, as I mentioned earlier, he was actually a major general in the Mexican-American War, so he establishes a good military reputation, which helps him win the vote for president in 1848. But notice it's not too far off. There's a pretty significant divide between Whigs and Democrats in this election. And then we do have Martin Van Buren run as a free soiler, but he doesn't get any of the electoral vote, but he does get a good amount of the popular vote. So this is a really good example of how increasingly sectional the country is becoming, how divided it is. But what's interesting here is in 1848, you still see that there are people from the North that are supporting Democrats, like Maine and New Hampshire, for example. But then there also are Southern states that are supporting the Whigs. All right, so really the difference between 1848 and, let's say, 1856, as far as elections are concerned, is really dramatic. In between this 1848 election and, again, an election like 1856, the divide becomes really tangibly between the North and the South, right? So that's something to really keep in mind. So what did these candidates stand for? All right, Lewis Cass, who was the, I guess, runner-up, so to speak, a Democrat from Michigan, he believed in this concept, which we'll explore a lot more in the next chapter, called popular sovereignty. All right, so popular sovereignty basically said that it was up to the people to decide the slavery question for their territory, right? So as a territory is getting closer to becoming a state, popular sovereignty allowed the people to actually vote on whether their future state would allow slaves. This is really controversial, and this is going to cause a lot of problems later, which we'll explore. All right, the winner, as I already mentioned, was Zachary Taylor, a Whig from Virginia. All right, and one of the reasons why he won is because he refuses to accept the Wilmot Proviso in 1846, and so that makes him popular by both Northerners and Southerners, which kind of explains why you have this interesting divide between North and South who are supporting him. And Martin Van Buren, even though he doesn't get any electoral votes, you see how much of the popular vote he got. So, a lot of historians say that Lewis Cass would have had a much better chance of winning if Martin Van Buren was not running as a third-party candidate. We already discussed the Mexican Cession. One area that I did not yet mention is this little sliver of land called the Gadsden Purchase. Now, this comes along slightly later, but the reason why the Gadsden Purchase is added to the U.S. in 1853 is because this is the time when the U.S. government is planning to lay railroad tracks all the way across the country, the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, just so you know, the Transcontinental Railroad actually ends up much farther north, right? But there were Southerners, pro-slavery for the most part, who wanted the railroad to pass farther south, right? To go through areas that had a rich agricultural economy, and of course areas that benefited from slave labor. But the problem was that the Rocky Mountains were much too steep for railroads to actually go through these very, very high altitude areas here. The Gadsden Purchase was slightly more flat, and so that's why the U.S. bought it from Mexico. Okay, so this really kind of solidifies the border between the U.S. and Mexico to the south. It has not changed since. All right, even more importantly is what's happening right after the Mexican War ends, okay? The discovery of large deposits of gold in Northern California. This is Sutter's Mill, California, which is near San Francisco. I actually have a spot somewhere on a map that shows us exactly where it is. Sutter's Fort was actually the destination for that doomed Dahmer party, but they never made it. Going back. So, not just Sutter's Mill, you have the Sacramento area with significant amounts of gold, but ultimately this is going to trigger the California Gold Rush, which starts technically in 1848, but really in 1849 the gold rush really starts in earnest, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why the San Francisco football team is called the 49ers, right? So the gold rush, like I was saying, really is kicking off in 1849, and it was seen as a really good opportunity for people who may not have yet established themselves economically to get rich, right? So many of the people who actually migrated to the West were people that were sort of similar to the initial colonists, like in Jamestown, for example. Tended to be tended to be single men. Tended to be men who had a slightly, I guess one could say, like adventurous approach towards their futures. Tended to be people who were opposed to a really strong central government, because if you're going west, you're sort of fleeing that kind of control, right? The ultimate destination for most of these gold rushers was Sutter's Mill, but there were certainly people that ended up going farther west to eventually really the major city that will form in San Francisco. All right, so San Francisco really kind of crops up overnight. By 1850, California itself has a big enough population to become a state, which really demonstrates how quickly the population grows. So again, going to San Francisco as a specific example, in 1848, San Francisco only has 1,000 people living in it. 2 years later, in 1850, the population of San Francisco is 35,000. That is a huge increase, right? And again, like I was saying, the population is big enough that by 1850, California applies for statehood, right? So, sorry, this got a little cut off, but just an image of people who do migrate out to the Sutter's Mill area to dig for gold. It sort of hopefully goes without saying that the majority of people who went west for the gold rush were disappointed, because the amount of gold was actually really overestimated in this area, and so a lot of people ended up migrating west, but ended up finding other sources of work. All right, so we already talked about the some of the trails that headed west, right? We talked about the Overland Trail. Oregon and California trails were two of the most popular routes to the California coast, right? And like I was saying before, you have in between 250 and 300,000 people migrating from east to west. And many of these are very dangerous journeys. You had many families who took a significant risk moving from east to west, did not necessarily have family or roots in their destination, had no jobs in their destination, so you can kind of gather maybe how desperate their situation was farther east to prompt them to move west. Okay, so I already talked about the Gadsden Purchase in a previous slide, but just notice it's a really good visual to see how much territory is added to the U.S. In the early to mid-19th century. Again, this really shows us manifest destiny actually happening, right? So the 1840s are really a significant year for territorial growth in the U.S. So just as a recap, we get Texas, right? The Texas territory at first was significantly larger than the modern state of Texas, as you see me outlining with my cursor here. Then you have the Mexican Cession, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And then, again, to add on later, there's the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. As we discussed earlier, the Oregon area was settled with a treaty that completely established the northern border of Canada and gave Vancouver Island to Canada, right? But this is all Oregon territory at first. It will later be divided into Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and parts of Montana. Also, in 1842, as we discussed earlier, this area of Maine and Canada is settled with the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, and one thing I neglected to mention is there's a tiny sliver of land near Minnesota that's also settled by this treaty. So you don't have to completely have 100% of all these little territorial acquisitions completely memorized, but looking at all these examples gives you a sense of really how significantly the country's growing in this short period of time. All right, so this is just an image in this time period that's really showing you how romanticized the image of the West is. Again, just a really good artistic portrayal of what Manifest Destiny truly meant to the American people. All right, another thing that is happening in the 1850s, albeit not always completely successfully, is that the U.S. is even attempting to uh, exert its influence farther outside of its borders by attempting to raid different areas of Latin America. And so we already know that the U.S. actually successfully goes to war against Mexico, which results in the Mexican Cession of 1848. But they also launch attempted raids into Honduras, Nicaragua, and Cuba, which are less successful. But still, at the very least, it shows that the U.S. is exerting more military dominance over its region. It shows us that the Monroe Doctrine is in full effect at this point, because the U.S. is really trying to be the dominant power on the Western Hemisphere. So just a few more things to discuss when we really wrap up our conversation about Manifest Destiny. The Mexican Cession means that the U.S. now literally expands from the East Coast, the Atlantic, to the West Coast, the Pacific, that from sea to shining sea notion. When the U.S. expands from one ocean to the other, it becomes a truly continental nation. It makes the U.S. a major power globally, right? The idea now also is that the U.S. has economic ties not only to the Atlantic world, but also to the Pacific world. And it's not surprising to us then that many migrants who come in during the California Gold Rush period are actually coming from Pacific areas, notably China. And so many of the workers on the Transcontinental Railroad were actually Chinese immigrants. Now, this is going to cause some interesting population patterns and some actually very negative kind of social effects, right? As Chinese laborers move into the U.S. for economic opportunities, namely to work on the railroads, they experience pretty significant discrimination when they arrive. What we're going to find is that not just Chinese, but other ethnicities are going to find themselves sort of settling in their own ethnic enclaves because they don't really feel like they're able to assimilate quickly into American white culture. So you're going to experience the growth of essentially ghettos, so a less PC term for ethnic enclave, in areas like San Francisco that still have a really significant Mexican population, for example. Also, as we discussed actually I think it was chapter 13, we discussed changing population patterns. It isn't just the Chinese that are living in these communities. You have, for example, sort of the Midwestern region has many Eastern European and German migrants. Many of them also settle in their own independent communities before they can fully assimilate into the U.S. And so by the late 19th century, we're going to see that some of these new population patterns are going to result in some really interesting immigration policies when that time comes. But that's really enough for us to master, hopefully, Manifest Destiny and the Mexican-American War. So, other unanswered questions. I keep repeating myself, but it's worth repeating in my mind. What's the future of slavery going to be, right? We obviously know what's going to happen. But by adding this huge amount of territory onto the U.S., this is a huge, huge issue that the government has essentially delayed for decades at this point, and it's going to become much more heated as we see in the future chapter. Once California becomes a state, it really launches a significant controversy. But we'll leave that to after the winter break, and I very much hope you have a nice, relaxing break. I hope that this assignment doesn't create a huge burden for you. I really don't want you to take any longer than an hour to do that DBQ, because that's how much time you would get in class. Okay, so again, enjoy that winter break. Take care, and I'll see you in January.